Thanks to Cage International and the organizers at INSAF for bringing us together for the launch of this important report. It's an honor to be part of this discussion. And what I want to do today is to basically step slightly back from the individual cases and ask a broader question, which is what kind of system made these things possible? What kind of systems made these cases possible? Where did it come from? How did it take root in Bangladesh? And why do elements of it continue to persist even after the fall of Sheikh Hasina? To explore that question, I want to begin with a story from a much earlier stage of human history. In medieval Spain, during the Inquisition, the witch burnings basically, the church often didn't need to prove that someone was a witch or a heretic. In many cases, the accusation itself was enough. The naming itself became the verdict. What followed, the interrogation, the spectacle of punishment, the burning, was merely theater. It was spectacle designed to produce fear. Public punishment served as a warning for everyone watching. Look, this is what happens when you cross the boundaries of acceptable belief. The Inquisition operated through a simple sequence. First, a threat was created through witches, heretics, enemies of the order. Second, individuals were designated as belonging to that category. And third, punishment was carried out publicly and dramatically so that society as a whole would learn the consequences of deviation. The goal wasn't simply to eliminate individuals. The goal was to discipline an entire population. What happened in Bangladesh between 2019 and 2024 can be seen as a sort of modern inquisition. Under the banner of counterterrorism, individuals could be named, removed from the protection of law, and punished in ways that served a broader political purpose. A system was constructed that defined which forms of belief, identity, and political aspirations were permissible and which were not. The report produced by Cage presents a snapshot, a sort of summary of that system. It records more than 1,200 extrajudicial killings, around 1,600 enforced disappearances, and tens of thousands of detentions. It also documents conviction rates exceeding 70% in anti-terrorism cases, many based on confessions extracted under torture or fabricated evidence. These numbers and the data is important because it shows that these were not isolated abuses of the system. This was the system. And the question this report forces us to ask is a deeper one. Where did this system come from? To answer that question, we have to begin with the global political environment in which the Bangladeshi state operated at that time. In 2001, George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, so-called global war on terror. But this war did not remain confined to bombs or military campaigns. It produced something far larger. It produced a legal and intellectual architecture designed to legitimize extraordinary power in the name of security. The war on terror discourse did not simply target violence, it increasingly treated political vision rooted in Islam as threats in themselves. Because those visions propose an alternative ordering of society, politics, and law. The perceived threat, in other words, was not simply militant groups or armed groups. The threat was Islam itself, as Islam offers a different model of political order, a different model of global order. So what was being criminalized was the political theology of Islam itself. What was being criminalized was basically Islam itself. And within this framework, Muslim identity itself increasingly became a matter of security concern. Muslims were not judged only for actions already committed, they were judged for their belief. They were judged for potential future danger. Ordinary practices such as prayer, charity, travel, speech, political speech could be reinterpreted through the security lens. Communities thus became subjects of surveillance, not because of what they had done, but because of what they might become. The result was the production of a permanent suspect class. This logic did not emerge in a historical vacuum. During the colonial era, European empires justified their expansion through the language of civilization. Their message was simple: you are barbaric, we have come to civilize you. During the era of the War on Terror, the American empire justified their expansion through the language of democracy, human rights, and development. The message was strikingly familiar. Your beliefs are dangerous, you are dangerous, and we must reshape your society for your own good. In the 19th century, the British colonial administrator William Hunter, in his book The Indian Muslims, described the followers of Imam Sayyid Ahmed Shahid rahimahullah, the members of Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya, as Hindustani fanatics. Their crime? They resisted British rule in Hindustan, and they wanted to establish an Islamic polity. The communities that supported them were labeled the fanatic camp. Today, similar phenomena are described in a different vocabulary. They are called Islamic terrorism. The terminology has changed, the mission hasn't. The governing logic remains. And within this logic, a familiar division emerges. That of the, quote, good Muslim and the, quote, bad Muslim. The good Muslim practices faith privately. He participates comfortably within liberal citizenship and poses no challenge to the existing political order. The bad Muslim, however, believes that Islam has something to say about how society should be organized, how politics should be organized, how the world should be organized, and that the Ummah is a political community, and that Islamic law has say in public life. The first is praised as being a moderate, while the second is marked as a radical. But the colonial continuity does not end at the level of language or the construction of categories. It extends into the legal architecture through which modern states govern dissent. Colonial rulers often governed through exceptional laws. Whenever resistance emerged, ordinary law was suspended and replaced with special powers. The British used this model with brutal efficiency in colonial India. Laws such as Bengal Regulation 3 of 1818 allowed the state to detain individuals indefinitely without trial. Later measures, such as the Defense of India Act and the Rowlatt Act, expanded these powers, allowing arrests on mere suspicion. Colonial rule, in other words, often operated through what we might call law in the form of lawlessness, legal frameworks that existed formally, but whose function was to remove entire populations from the protection of ordinary justice. In colonial regimes, the target was the rebellious subject. In modern counter-terror regimes, the target becomes the, quote, radical Muslim. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben has described this condition in The Age of War on Terror as a permanent state of exception, a situation where law is suspended in the name of protecting order and security, where Muslims, such as the ones detained in Guantanamo Bay, become what he calls homo sacer, persons who can be killed without their killing being recognized as murder in the full moral or legal sense. The global counter-terror framework did not remain confined to the Western states. It was actively adopted and adapted within Bangladesh. In 2008, just before the Awami League returned to power, Sheikh Hasina's son, Shojib Waja Joy, co-authored an article in the Harvard International Review warning that Bangladesh risked becoming the next Afghanistan. The article suggested that madrasas were producing extremism and that radicalization had penetrated significant parts of the society, including the armed forces. This so-called paper served as a political sales pitch. It framed Bangladesh as a frontline state in the global war on terror and positioned the Awami League as the indispensable partner in that struggle. Over the following decade, Bangladesh received substantial international support under the banner of counter-terrorism operations, especially from the US and the UK. And of course, the whole Hasina regime was supported by India. Security forces thus expanded their capacities, legal frameworks were strengthened, institutions such as the Rapid Action Battalion and the Counter-Terrorism and Transnational Crime Unit became central actors in the country's security architecture. But the system did not rest on global politics alone. It also drew upon domestic legal foundations that long predated the war on terror. The Special Powers Act of 1975, a colonial heirloom in both structure and spirit, granted the state sweeping powers of preventive detention. Like earlier colonial emergency laws, it allowed individuals to be imprisoned without trial in the name of national security. After 2009, this older architecture was expanded through new legal instruments such as the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Specialized Anti-Terrorism Tribunals, and later the Digital Security Act. These laws created an elastic legal framework in which the boundaries of terrorism, extremism, and digital threats could be defined broadly enough to capture almost any form of dissent. Under such laws, the standards of judgment begin to shift. So today in Bangladesh, when secular political actors block roads or organize protests, it is described as democratic activism. When Islamists mobilize in the streets, the same act is framed as extremism. A leftist who calls for revolutionary change may be described as a radical thinker, but an Islamist who speaks of transforming society becomes a militant, a terrorist, a jihadi. Once that label is applied, all legal protections disappear. In this way, the war on terror provided the language through which older techniques of repression, colonial techniques of repression, could be revived. This is why the counter-terror regime cannot be understood simply as the project of a single regime, of Hasina government. Of course, Sheikh Hasina institutionalized it, but the intellectual and institutional conditions that sustained it were far broader. Ever since the inception of Bangladesh, much of the secular intelligentsia has viewed Islamic identity with suspicion. Part of this comes from the ideology of Bengali nationalism, shaped by the intellectual traditions that emerged from colonial Calcutta. Within that framework, Islamic social and political aspiration, really any public aspect of Islam, is seen as being in conflict with authentic Bengali culture and modernity. And once that assumption takes hold, the securitization of Islamic political expression begins to appear not only as acceptable, but also as progressive. That's why, even after the departure of Hasina from power in August 2024, elements of the same logic remain visible. Let me mention just a few examples. The commission investigating enforced disappearances has focused largely on victims linked to the major political parties, particularly the BNP and the Jamaat. Yet, of an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 disappearances, the Commission has verified only around 1,500 cases. This leaves the majority, many of them individuals with no political affiliation, still outside the scope of formal investigation or recognition as victims. The second example, during the Hasina years, families of victims of enforced disappearance, often could not file general diaries because the police refused to register them, a fact that the Commission itself has acknowledged. Yet in several cases, especially involving victims with Islamist leanings, official recognition of victimhood has been denied precisely because no GD exists. This is paradoxical. So the logic of suspicion continues. The Indian government also relied on the same emergency powers. In one case, from December 2025, a scholar by the name of Atal Rahman Bikrampuri and an activist was detained by plainclothes officers and sentenced to 90 days of detention under the Special Powers Act. No formal charges were presented. The detention was issued simply on the basis of an order from the Ministry of Home Affairs. Most strikingly, however, are the cases of those individuals who remain imprisoned on the basis of confessions extracted through torture during the Hasina era. In several high-profile militancy trials, including the 2015 killing of writer Abhijit Roy, death sentences relied heavily on confessions extracted under torture and later recorded before a magistrate as formal confessions. In many of these cases, little independent evidence was presented in court. 5 men were sentenced to death in that particular case alone, the case of Abhijit Roy. One of them, Muzammil Hussain Simon, whose case has been documented by Cage itself in a separate article, was convicted primarily on the basis of such coerced statements. Many others convicted in similar cases remain on death row. These cases are only a small sample of a much wider reality. The machinery may have slowed, but it has not yet been dismantled. And at the center of the machinery is a single word, Jongi. At the center of the system is this word. Once that word is applied, once that label is applied, the individual is pushed outside the normal universe of rights and protections. Police denies custody, media parrots official narratives, and courts accept confessions obtained under torture. Even lawyers hesitated to defend this person. Families are afraid even to claim the bodies of those killed in so-called crossfires. Communities avoid holding the janaza, the funeral prayers. The suffering of a Jongi no longer demands sympathy. In medieval inquisitions, people were named into categories that could be punished without sympathy. Part of what the cage report does is to restore the names of those who were stripped of them. It documents the lives behind the labels. It records the families left searching for answers. The fall of Hasina may mark the end of a political era, but justice requires more than a change of government. It requires confronting the system itself. That means truth for victims, accountability for the perpetrators, and dismantling the laws and institutions that enabled these abuses. Without that reckoning, the machinery of repression may pause, but will not disappear. And so far, that reckoning has not happened. And if we are being honest, the chances of it happening appear to be slim. But we still have to try, and we still have to preserve, for all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And so the work must continue. And because Allah reminds us in the Quran, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ اللَّهَ غَافِلًا عَمَّا يَعْمَلُ الظَّالِمِينَ. Never think that Allah is unaware of what the oppressors do. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.